The first thing I saw when I pulled into my driveway was an HOA golf cart blocking half my garage. The second was a complete stranger carrying a box labeled commercial herbicide through my front door. I had just finished a 12-hour night shift at the hospital. I was exhausted, still wearing my work badge, expecting nothing more than coffee and a few hours of sleep. Instead, I walked into my own garage and found 3 employees from Landmark Community Services stacking lawn equipment, chemical containers, traffic cones, and barricades inside like they owned the place. My truck had been shoved against the wall. There was a fresh dent in the driver's side door. The framed photo of my late father, the one that had sat on his workbench for years, was lying face down in shattered glass. And standing in the middle of it all was HOA President Brenda Whitmore, calmly checking items off a clipboard as if this were her property. When I demanded to know what they were doing inside my garage, she didn't apologize. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "The HOA approved this space for community storage. You don't get to interfere." I told her she was standing on my deeded property. She smiled. Then she ordered one of the workers to replace my garage lock and warned that if I tried to stop them, I'd be fined every single day. At that moment, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. They genuinely believed they could take my garage, Ambrani, while I stood there watching. So I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and made one decision that changed everything. 6 months before the HOA took over my garage, I moved back into the house where I had grown up. It was a modest 2-story home near the rear entrance of Pine Hollow, a planned community outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The neighborhood had neat lawns, identical mailboxes, and an HOA that seemed to care more about appearances than people. From the street, my house looked ordinary. To me, it held nearly every important memory I had left. My father, Robert Carter, had owned the place for 23 years. He had worked as an electrician until his hands became too stiff to handle tools safely, but he never stopped building things in the garage. He made shelves, repaired furniture, restored old radios, and taught me that anything worth keeping deserved patience. After he died, the house passed to me through his estate. Selling it would have been easier. The roof needed repairs, the kitchen was outdated, and my commute to the hospital became longer. But every room carried something I was not ready to lose. The garage mattered most. One side held my pickup truck and work equipment. The other remained almost exactly as my father had left it. His heavy wooden workbench stood beneath the rear window. His tools were arranged on a pegboard, each one outlined in faded black marker. Boxes of photographs rested on metal shelves, and an unfinished oak chair sat in the corner under a canvas cover. That chair had been his final project. He had shaped the legs and assembled the frame but never completed the backrest. I planned to finish it slowly, using his tools and the notes he had left inside a stained notebook. I was not trying to create anything valuable. I simply wanted to complete one last thing with him, even if he was no longer there. I was not the kind of homeowner who wanted a fight with an HOA. I paid my dues on time, kept the grass trimmed, and brought my trash cans inside before the deadline. I worked long shifts maintaining medical equipment at a regional hospital, so peace mattered more to me than winning arguments at board meetings. Brenda Whitmore seemed to view that quietness as weakness. She had served as HOA president for 3 years and treated Pine Hollow as if it were a private company she owned. Under her leadership, violation notices became more frequent and more aggressive. Residents were fined for faded basketball hoops, curtains visible from the street, and guest vehicles that remained overnight. Most people complained privately but stayed silent in public. Brenda controlled the meeting agenda, interrupted anyone who challenged her, and regularly reminded residents that Landmark Community Services supported the board's decisions. Landmark handled billing, maintenance coordination, enforcement notices, and access records for the neighborhood. Its regional supervisor, Todd Mercer, attended nearly every important meeting. He rarely questioned Brenda because Pine Hollow's management contract was worth close to $180,000 a year. A few weeks before the garage incident, the HOA lost access to a rented storage unit where it kept landscaping equipment and event supplies. Renovations at the clubhouse had already begun, leaving the board with nowhere to store those items. The HOA sent residents a general email asking for temporary storage suggestions. I read it after a night shift and deleted it because nothing in the message mentioned my address, my garage, or any request for private space. What I did not know was that Brenda had already noticed my schedule. She knew my truck was often gone overnight. She knew I slept during the day. She also knew my garage was larger than most garages in Pine Hollow and located only a short distance from the service gate. To her, it was not part of my home or a place filled with my father's belongings. It was unused square footage that could save the HOA several $1,000s. If you have ever dealt with an HOA that confused community rules with ownership rights, share your thoughts in the comments. Many homeowners stay silent because they assume the board must know the law. I made that same mistake until Brenda decided that my silence gave her permission. 2 days before I found strangers inside my garage, my driveway camera recorded Brenda and Todd standing near the side window. They photographed the door, tested the handle, and looked through the glass. Then Todd checked something on his phone while Brenda pointed toward the keypad. They were not looking for storage suggestions anymore. They were planning how to get inside without asking me. The first unauthorized entry happened 3 days before I found the HOA equipment inside my garage. My driveway camera showed Brenda arriving just after 10 in the morning with Todd and a landmark maintenance technician. They did not knock on the front door. They walked directly to the garage, checked the side window, and studied the keypad mounted beside the frame. Todd appeared uncertain. He kept looking toward the street and checking his phone while Brenda pointed at the keypad and gestured toward the service gate. The technician eventually entered a 6-digit code. On the second attempt, the garage door began to rise. That code had belonged to my father. Years earlier, after a minor heart attack, he had provided an emergency access number to the community management office so paramedics could enter if he could not reach the door. The code was supposed to be restricted to genuine emergencies. It had never been permission for the HOA to enter the garage whenever it needed extra space. Once the door opened, Brenda walked inside as if she had been given a key. The camera mounted above my father's workbench recorded everything. Todd inspected the shelves, measured the open floor space, and photographed my truck. Brenda lifted the canvas covering the unfinished oak chair, looked at it briefly, and dropped the cover onto the floor. No one contacted me. Later that afternoon, 2 landmark trucks arrived with landscaping equipment, plastic barricades, folding tables, chemical containers, and boxes of event supplies. The workers pushed my truck several feet toward the wall to create more room. One of them clipped the driver's side door with a metal cart, leaving a long dent in the paint. They stacked boxes on my father's workbench and moved several containers of tools without labeling where anything belonged. A framed photograph from his retirement party was knocked to the floor. The glass shattered, and one employee swept the pieces into a trash bag without preserving the photograph or reporting the damage. Several personal storage boxes were carried outside and placed near the rear patio. They were covered with a thin plastic tarp that lifted every time the wind changed. Those boxes contained family photographs, tax records, and some of my father's handwritten notes. By the time I returned from work, the garage no longer looked like part of my home. It looked like a crowded storage warehouse. Brenda handed me a document titled Emergency Community Use Notice. It claimed the HOA needed temporary access to prevent disruption to essential neighborhood operations. The notice did not cite a specific bylaw, identify any emergency, or contain my signature. It had been printed that morning. Todd claimed Landmark had authority to enter because the HOA had approved the arrangement. When I asked for the board resolution, he redirected me to Brenda. When I asked Brenda for the vote record, she said internal board decisions did not require my approval. The situation became worse when I told them to remove everything immediately. Brenda treated my refusal as a violation. She accused me of obstructing community maintenance and warned that the HOA could impose a daily fine until I cooperated. Todd supported her version and described the takeover as temporary, reasonable, and already authorized. Then Brenda ordered a worker to install a new padlock on the side access door. That was the moment the dispute stopped feeling like an HOA disagreement and started feeling like a seizure of property. My garage was attached to my house, listed on my deed, and filled with my belongings. Yet strangers were changing the lock while I stood in my own driveway. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and explained that people had entered my garage without permission. Brenda immediately reframed the situation as a civil disagreement between a homeowner and his association. When the first deputy arrived, she presented the emergency community use notice and claimed I had previously agreed to cooperate. Todd repeated that the HOA had authorized Landmark to use the space and suggested I had changed my mind after the equipment was delivered. At that point, I had not yet reviewed the camera recordings. I knew I had never agreed. But Brenda spoke with the confidence of someone who expected official paperwork to outweigh my word. The deputy advised both sides not to move or damage property until the ownership documents and access rights could be verified. It was a cautious response, but Brenda treated it like permission to continue. Before leaving, she instructed the workers to secure the garage with the new lock. She also told me I was not to interfere with Landmark's equipment. That evening, 3 violation notices appeared in my email. The first accused me of obstructing an authorized contractor. The second claimed I had created a disturbance in a common service area. The third alleged that I had refused emergency access. The combined initial fines totaled $750, with additional daily penalties threatened if I continued to deny access. The next morning, Landmark employees returned before sunrise. They used my driveway as a loading zone, left the garage door open, and moved equipment in and out while my personal belongings remained exposed to the street. By noon, a neighbor sent me a screenshot from the Pine Hollow residents group. Brenda had told several homeowners that I had volunteered the garage, then withdrawn permission in an attempt to demand money from the HOA. I did not respond online. I went inside, opened the security system on my computer, and began reviewing the footage frame by frame. Less than 20 minutes later, I found the recording that changed everything. The microphone had captured Todd asking whether they needed written permission before using the emergency code. Brenda's response made it clear she already knew they had none. I watched the recording 3 times before I trusted what I was hearing. Todd stood near the keypad with his phone in one hand, and the old access code written on a maintenance sheet in the other. He asked Brenda whether they should wait for written permission before opening the garage. Brenda looked toward the street, then toward my darkened front windows. She knew I had worked overnight. She knew I would probably be asleep for most of the day. The camera microphone captured her explaining that I would not notice until the equipment had already been moved. By then, she said, the HOA could present the takeover as a temporary arrangement that was too inconvenient to reverse. That single recording destroyed the claim that any misunderstanding had occurred. Brenda knew she did not have permission. Todd knew the emergency code was restricted. They entered anyway because they believed possession would give them leverage. I did not send the clip to the neighborhood group. I did not confront Brenda again. I understood that one dramatic video could create outrage, but a complete record could create consequences. I downloaded the original files from all 3 cameras. The driveway camera showed when each vehicle arrived and left. The doorbell camera recorded Brenda's statements after I returned home. The interior camera captured the workers moving my truck, stacking materials on my father's workbench, damaging the framed photograph, and sweeping broken glass into a trash bag. I saved the files in their original format. With their metadata intact, I copied them to 2 external drives and uploaded another set to encrypted cloud storage. I created a written timeline listing every entry, every delivery, every notice, and every item that had been moved or damaged. The garage door system kept its own access history. Its digital log showed that my father's emergency code had been entered at 10:14 on Tuesday morning. That timestamp matched the video of Todd, Brenda, and the Landmark technician standing beside the keypad. I photographed the new lock, the dent in my truck, the scraped floor, the displaced boxes, and the marks left on the workbench. I found the damaged photograph in the trash bag and placed the glass, frame, and torn backing into separate containers. Then I inspected the personal boxes the workers had moved outside. Rain had slipped beneath the plastic tarp. Several folders were damp, and the edges of my father's handwritten notes had begun to curl. A box containing tax records had softened at the bottom. Some of the ink on old family photographs had started to bleed. That damage affected me more than the dent in the truck. The HOA could pay to repair metal and paint. It could not replace my father's handwriting or recreate photographs from 30 years earlier. I contacted a vehicle repair shop, a document restoration company, and a furniture specialist. I requested written estimates, rather than informal opinions. Every loss needed a date, a description, and a defensible dollar amount. The next morning, I visited the county recorder's office. The recorded deed showed that the house, driveway, and attached garage were entirely within my property boundaries. There was no storage easement, maintenance easement, or community use right attached to the garage. The only recorded easements concerned underground utilities near the street. I ordered a certified copy. After that, I read every section of the Pine Hollow Declaration, bylaws, and enforcement policy. The documents allowed the HOA to enter private property only when an immediate threat could damage another home or common property. Examples included fire, severe water leakage, structural collapse, or another urgent condition that could not wait for the owner. A missing storage unit was not an emergency. Saving money was not an emergency. Landscaping equipment did not become essential merely because Brenda used that word on a notice. I also found that violation fines required written notice, a specific rule, citation, and an opportunity for a hearing. None of the 3 notices sent to me included a valid rule number. One accused me of creating a disturbance in a common service area even though the county deed proved the garage and driveway were private property. I submitted a formal records request to the HOA. I asked for the board vote authorizing the entry, all communications involving my address, landmarks access policy, the emergency code procedure, and the full management contract. Brenda delayed the response for several days. When she finally sent documents, the package contained a 1-page meeting summary referring vaguely to temporary storage alternatives. My address did not appear anywhere. The file properties revealed something even more suspicious. The summary had been modified the day after I called the sheriff. I contacted Elena Ruiz, the attorney who had helped settle my father's estate. She specialized in real estate and property disputes, but her first instruction was not to file a lawsuit. She told me to preserve everything and stop communicating directly with Brenda or Todd. Elena reviewed the deed, the HOA documents, the video, the fines, and the access log. She identified possible claims involving unauthorized entry, property damage, misuse of restricted access information, and false representations made during the sheriff's response. She also warned me that the strongest part of the case might not be the trespass itself. Landmark had been entrusted with confidential emergency access information belonging to residents. If its employees used that information for convenience rather than safety, the company could face consequences far beyond the damage inside my garage. Elena sent a preservation letter to the HOA, Landmark, and their insurers. It required them to retain emails, text messages, work orders, access logs, meeting notes, internal reports, and all communications involving my address. She followed it with a demand that the equipment be removed under supervision, the fines be suspended, and no one enter my property again without written consent. That same afternoon, a board member named Susan Hale contacted me privately. Susan said the board had never voted to use my garage. Brenda had told the other directors that I had already volunteered the space, and that Landmark was simply coordinating the move. Susan forwarded an internal email chain. In the messages, Todd estimated that renting a commercial storage unit would cost the HOA about $4,800 for the required period. Brenda responded that my garage was closer, larger, and free. She wrote that any objections could be handled after the equipment was inside. The email proved motive, the video proved intent, the deed proved ownership. But Elena kept reading. Buried deep inside Landmark's management agreement, she found a termination clause covering unauthorized property access, misuse of resident security information, and dishonest statements made while performing HOA duties. If the board concluded that Landmark had violated that clause, Pine Hollow could cancel the contract immediately without paying the usual early termination penalty. That contract was worth almost $180,000 a year. Brenda had taken over my garage to save less than $5,000. The evidence on my cameras was now threatening to cost her management company nearly 40 times that amount. Elena did not begin with the trespass footage. She began with the contract. The management agreement between Pine Hollow and Landmark Community Services was 83 pages long, filled with routine language about billing, maintenance, inspections, and enforcement. Most residents had never seen it. Brenda had often referred to Landmark as if the company were simply an extension of the board, free to act wherever the HOA directed. But the contract said otherwise. Landmark was required to follow the governing documents, protect resident information, and use emergency access credentials only when there was a documented threat to life or property. Any deliberate misuse of those credentials could be treated as a material breach. A second clause required Landmark employees to give accurate information to law enforcement, insurers, and board members. A third allowed Pine Hollow to terminate the contract immediately if Landmark entered private property without lawful authority or used confidential access data for an unauthorized purpose. There was no grace period. There was no requirement that the HOA give Landmark a chance to correct the problem. There was no early termination payment if the breach involved security information or unauthorized entry. The moment Elena showed me those provisions, the entire balance of power changed. Until then, Brenda had acted as though I was the one facing risk. She had threatened daily fines, accused me of obstructing contractors, and told neighbors that I had created the conflict. Todd had assumed Landmark's legal department and insurance coverage would make the problem disappear. But the contract exposed what both of them had failed to understand. The emergency code was not merely a number used to open a garage door. It was protected resident access information. Landmark had received it because my father had once needed medical assistance, and the company had a duty to restrict its use. Todd had taken that confidential information from Landmark's system and used it to save the HOA the cost of renting storage. The security footage proved he knew the purpose was unauthorized. The recording showed him standing beside the keypad, asking whether written permission was required. It also showed Brenda telling him that I would probably not notice until the equipment was already inside. There was no confusion. There was no accidental reliance on an unclear bylaw. They had discussed the lack of permission before entering. Elena organized the evidence into 4 categories. The first established ownership. My certified deed showed that the garage and driveway were private property. The county records contained no easement, allowing the HOA to store equipment there. The second established the limits of HOA authority. Pine Hollow's governing documents permitted emergency entry only to stop immediate danger. Renovation delays and storage expenses did not qualify. The third established intent. The video, access log, and internal emails showed that Brenda and Todd understood they lacked consent but proceeded because they believed moving the equipment first would pressure me into accepting the arrangement. The fourth established financial motive. The email chain showed that the HOA wanted to avoid approximately $4,800 in storage costs. Elena combined everything into a formal demand package. It included the deed, camera timestamps, copies of the fines, photographs of the damage, repair estimates, the modified meeting summary, Susan's email chain, the garage access log, and the relevant sections of Landmark's contract. The package went to Pine Hollow's attorney, Landmark's general counsel, both insurance carriers, and every HOA board member. Elena did not threaten them with dramatic language. She gave them a deadline. Landmark had 24 hours to stop accessing my property and arrange supervised removal of its equipment. The HOA had to suspend all fines immediately. Both parties had to preserve every record connected to the entry, including messages that had been deleted from personal phones. The letter also warned that any attempt to alter access logs, meeting records, or internal communications after receiving the preservation notice could create separate legal consequences. Todd called me less than an hour after the package was delivered. I did not answer. He left a message describing the situation as an unfortunate operational mistake. He offered to have the equipment removed quietly, repair the frame, and ask Brenda to withdraw the fines. He said there was no reason to involve Landmark's corporate office or the full HOA board. A second message was more direct. Todd offered to reimburse me personally if I agreed not to distribute the security footage. I forwarded both recordings to Elena. Brenda tried a different approach. She sent an email to the neighborhood claiming that a homeowner had misunderstood a temporary emergency arrangement. She did not use my name, but everyone knew which garage she meant. She insisted the board had acted in good faith and warned residents against spreading incomplete information. Susan replied to all board members. She stated that no board vote had authorized the use of my garage. She attached the original meeting minutes and requested an emergency session to review Brenda's conduct and Landmark's contract. That was when Landmark's corporate office finally examined the footage. The company suspended Todd before the end of the day. A regional vice president contacted Elena and confirmed that the emergency code should never have been used for storage access. He also admitted that Todd had failed to file an incident report after my truck and personal property were damaged. Brenda attempted to place all responsibility on Landmark. She told the board that Todd had assured her the access was legal, but the interior camera had captured her giving the order to proceed after Todd questioned whether permission was required. The video did not merely contradict her. It removed every possible excuse. At the emergency board session, Pine Hollow's attorney explained that continuing to defend the entry could expose the association to greater liability. The fines against me had no valid basis. The garage was not common property, and the emergency community use notice had no authority under the bylaws. Then, the attorney turned to the landmark agreement. Because the company had used restricted resident access information for a non-emergency purpose, the board had grounds to invoke termination for cause. Pine Hollow could cancel the contract without paying the substantial penalty normally required for early termination. For the first time since the conflict began, Brenda stopped interrupting. The contract she had relied on to intimidate residents was now threatening the management company that had enforced her decisions for years. Todd had risked a contract worth nearly $180,000 annually to avoid a storage bill of less than $5,000. And Brenda had risked her position as HOA president because she believed a quiet homeowner working night shifts would never check his cameras. But the contract was only one problem. While reviewing the inventory shown in the garage footage, Elena noticed several chemical containers labeled for commercial landscaping use. They had been stored beside my gas water heater without ventilation, containment, or fire safety approval. She sent the footage to the county fire marshal and code enforcement. What began as a property dispute was about to become an official safety investigation. The next morning, 3 official vehicles stopped in front of my house. Deputy Marcus Hill arrived first. Behind him came a county code enforcement truck and a fire marshal's SUV. A regional vice president from Landmark was already waiting near the curb with 2 employees and an empty box truck. Brenda appeared a few minutes later in the HOA golf cart, carrying the same clipboard she had held when I first found strangers inside my garage. This time, she did not walk onto my driveway. Elena had instructed me not to unlock anything until the officials documented the scene. I met them at the front of the property with a certified copy of my deed, the access log, printed camera timestamps, the HOA bylaws, and the preservation letter. Marcus reviewed the deed first. He confirmed that the driveway and attached garage were entirely within my private parcel. There was no recorded easement granting Pine Hollow or Landmark a right to store equipment, enter for convenience, or restrict my access. Then he watched the footage. The video showed the technician entering my father's emergency code. It showed Todd asking about permission. It showed Brenda ordering everyone to continue before I returned. It also showed her later telling the responding deputy that I had already agreed. Marcus stopped the recording at that moment and wrote a note in his report. He explained that he was not there to resolve every civil claim, but the evidence clearly contradicted the version Brenda had given during the first sheriff's response. He warned everyone present that no one was to enter the garage again without my written consent or a genuine emergency recognized by law. The fire marshal inspected the containers visible through the garage window. Several held concentrated landscaping chemicals, others contained fuel and solvent-based products. They had been stacked near my gas water heater without proper spacing, ventilation, spill containment, or approved commercial storage conditions. He ordered the garage opened for a safety inspection. Once inside, the officials photographed every container before Landmark touched anything. The fire marshal recorded the product labels, storage locations, and distance from ignition sources. Code enforcement documented that commercial materials had been stored in a residential garage without authorization. Brenda tried to describe the equipment as ordinary neighborhood supplies. The fire marshal did not argue with her. He simply pointed to the warning symbols on the containers and continued completing his report. Landmark's vice president looked increasingly uncomfortable as the inspection progressed. His employees found no approved work order, no emergency report, and no signed consent form connected to my address. The company had a detailed process for using resident access codes. Todd had ignored every step. Under official supervision, Landmark began removing the equipment. Each item was photographed and listed before it left. The workers carried out blowers, barricades, folding tables, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel cans, and boxes of maintenance records. When they moved the final stack away from my father's workbench, the full extent of the damage became visible. The wood surface had deep scratches. One drawer had been forced shut against a misplaced tool. A dark chemical ring marked the corner where a leaking container had rested. The insurance adjuster added everything to the claim. Marcus also documented the replacement lock Landmark had installed on the side door. Because it had prevented me from freely accessing part of my own home, the lock and installation order became part of the official record. By midday, my garage was empty of HOA property. But the most important confrontation happened that evening at Pine Hollow's emergency board meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Residents stood along the walls and crowded the hallway. Many had come because they wanted to know whether Landmarks still held emergency codes for their homes. Elena presented the evidence in chronological order. She showed the deed. She displayed the bylaw limiting emergency entry. She played the clip of Todd questioning the lack of written permission. Then she played Brenda's response. The room became completely silent. Susan introduced the original board minutes, proving there had been no vote to use my garage. She also displayed Brenda's email, describing my property as a free alternative to a $4,800 storage unit. Landmark's vice president admitted the company had violated its own security policy. He confirmed that Todd had been suspended and that a broader audit of resident access records had begun. Brenda attempted to shift responsibility onto him. She claimed she had relied on Landmark's professional judgment. Elena replayed the interior camera footage showing Brenda directing the technician to proceed after Todd raised concerns. There was nothing left to debate. Pine Hollow's attorney advised the board that the fines issued against me were unsupported and should be withdrawn immediately. He also confirmed that the misuse of my emergency code triggered the termination for cause provision in Landmark's contract. The board voted 4-1. Brenda cast the only opposing vote. Landmark's management contract, worth nearly $180,000 a year, was terminated without an early cancellation payment. For years, Brenda had relied on that company to send notices, impose fines, and make her authority look absolute. Now the same contract had collapsed because one security camera had preserved the truth she assumed no one would ever hear. And before the meeting ended, Susan made one final motion. She asked the board to remove Brenda as HOA president. Susan's motion passed before the night was over. Brenda was removed as HOA president by the same board she had spent years controlling. She remained a homeowner in Pine Hollow, but she lost the authority to issue directives, control meeting agendas, or represent the association in official matters. The 3 fines against me, totaling $750, were canceled immediately. The board also sent a written acknowledgement confirming that my garage and driveway were private property and that the HOA had no right to enter, store equipment, or restrict my access without lawful consent. Landmark's insurance carrier accepted responsibility for the damage caused during the unauthorized use of the garage. The final settlement covered the dent in my truck, replacement of the lock and keypad, restoration of damaged documents and photographs, repairs to my father's workbench, attorney fees, and compensation for the property that could not be fully restored. The total came to approximately $21,600. Todd lost his position as regional supervisor after Landmark completed its internal investigation. The company also began auditing emergency access codes across every community under its management. Homeowners were notified about who could view those codes, when they could be used, and how residents could remove them from the system. Pine Hollow adopted a new access policy as well. Except in a documented emergency involving immediate danger, no board member, contractor, or management employee could enter private property without written permission from the owner. Every emergency entry would require a report, a timestamp, and board review. It was the kind of rule that should have existed from the beginning. A few weeks later, I stood inside my garage after the final repair crew had left. The chemical stain was gone. The truck door had been repainted. My father's tools were back on the pegboard, and the restored photograph sat in a new frame above his workbench. The old oak chair still waited in the corner. I finished it that winter. I shaped the final pieces using my father's notes, sanded the wood by hand, and applied the same dark finish he had used on the workbench. When it was done, I placed it beneath the photograph the HOA workers had nearly destroyed. That chair became a reminder that protecting property is not always about money. Sometimes it is about defending the memories, security, and dignity attached to a place other people see as empty space. Brenda believed authority meant she could act first and invent permission later. Todd believed a corporate contract would protect him from a quiet homeowner. Both of them assumed I would become angry, make a mistake, and give them a reason to blame me. Instead, I saved the footage, checked the deed, read the bylaws, preserved the records, and let the evidence speak in the room where their power mattered most. If you believe an HOA should never be allowed to treat private property like community storage, share your opinion in the comments. Send this story to another homeowner who may need the reminder. Save the video for future reference, and subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people who protected their homes by understanding their rights. I did not win because I shouted louder than Brenda. I won because her authority ended at my property line, and my cameras proved exactly when she crossed it.